Okay, once again, thank you for calling in. My name is Arthur O'Connor. I'm the Academic Director of the Masters in Data Analytics, Bachelor's of Science in Information Systems, and Bachelor of Arts in Communications and Media online degree programs here at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. I have a presentation today on creative statistics, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, and hopefully I'll give you some insight onto what I mean by that. And given this is a webinar, the format, as much as I would like to take questions during the presentation, the format really doesn't lend itself to that. So at the end of the presentation, you can type in questions in that chat box you have on your screen if you are on the screen, and I will try to answer as many questions as I can given the time frame that is allowed. So I guess we're at 3 minutes after the hour, so why don't we begin with the presentation. If we can do that. Oh, there we go. Okay, so today's topic is basically the story of how empirical evidence supporting a new theory on the relationship between organizational values and industry automation was discovered as a demonstration of how publicly available data from so many different data types is expanding opportunities for innovative secondary research. Secondary research, for those who are not in the field, means doing research based on existing data rather than creating your own data through a survey or other data gathering mechanisms, which is called primary research. And the purpose of my talk today is not so much the actual research study itself, but it's just to show you as an example the really interesting things you can do with the data sets that are, free and out there on the web. And not only is the data free, but also a lot of the tools are open source tools that you can start playing around with. And it really, what I'm trying to do is trying to underscore the fact that data science is not just about programming or applied math or statistics, but it's essentially about intellectual curiosity, creativity, and exploration. So basically, the agenda here is I'm going to go through the basic steps of research. This should be familiar to those of you in the research world, the literature review, theory building, variables, operationalizing the hypotheses, discussing the results of the linear models, and then I'd like to share with you just a small subset of some of the data sources that are out there for you to explore and play with, and then just a short talk about who we are and kind of what we do here at SPS. Where the idea for this study originated, this has been many years in the making. When I graduated from college way back when, there was a severe recession in the country, and so I basically bummed around the country picking up jobs and working as a truck driver, unloading airplanes. I worked in the oil fields of Texas, in Pasadena, Texas, which is right outside of Houston. And and then later in life, when I became a reporter and an editor, I would interview lots of different organizations, and I just kind of noticed this, sort of pattern of organizational behavior. For example, when I was an oil field worker out in Houston, Texas, I was working with, I was essentially a drifter, and many of the people I worked with on this team were, people that had done time, and one guy didn't show up for work one morning, and well, he was shot trying to rob a convenience store. So I just happened to notice that it was the standards of behavior and the way people treat each other were kind of radically different from what I was used to. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. My dad was an executive for CBS Television Network. My mom was on the faculty of Princeton University, so things were a little bit different. And later in life, when, for example, when I joined my first corporate job was a speechwriter, and where the place I worked with, all the women were secretaries and all the men were either managers like myself or executives. And so, and that come from publishing, where women had very senior level roles. So I just sort of noticed something, and what it was is that why do the cultures of companies that operate in some types of industries, which were sort of all more automated and mechanized, seemed a little bit behind the times. And I'm show you the El Macho character. He's kind of stuck in the 70s or 80s. I would love to say that I never dressed like that, but I'd be lying to you. At least I didn't wear a medallion. I'm just glad that they didn't have face back in those days to demonstrate that. Whereas organizations that operated in kind of more people-oriented businesses, advertising, fashion, media, graphic design, just appeared to have more progressive, contemporary organizational practices and policies. They looked and dressed more kind of up-to-date. The way they spoke was a little more up-to-date than the other types of firms. And it just got me wondering, could there be a relationship between industry automation with organizational adaptation to changes in social values? And so, like a good researcher, my first step was to review the literature, and the reason why you do that is for three reasons mostly. What theories prevail in the understanding of the role of automation on organizational adaptation to emerging social values, what data sets, variables, models, and methods are used to measure these things, and what are the known predictors of these effects and why. Well, I was greatly surprised by the fact that no one actually had looked at this before, which was sort of surprising. There is a wealth of research in terms of organizational and institutional theory. The biggest one, or the biggest body of work, is something called institutional theory, where it basically says that organizations need to conform to rules and systems of belief in the prevailing environment to survive. And they face very powerful pressures to conform to the prevailing values. And there's that quote from DiMaggio and Powell: organizations compete not just for research and customers, but for political power and institutional legitimacy, meaning you have to sort of be seen as a legitimate, viable player in a market if you expect to conduct business. And there's three types of these forces that DiMaggio and Powell explored: mimetic, coercive, and normative. Mimetic meaning, gas stations try to be like other gas stations. There's a sort of a conventional way of, the pumps are in a row, there's different islands, and they just do that because that's perceived as the efficient and the way to do that. Coercive institutional pressures are things that they're forced to do. There are regulations regarding environmental protection, there are health and safety laws, there are building codes. And then there are normative institutional pressures, and that's where this study focuses on. Normative, meaning there's nothing written down, there's no industry standard, just people sort of do that. Men wear suits and ties in business environments. Why? Because you're supposed to do that. That's just sort of expected of you. So, and there's also lots of research in the way that organizations adopt to social context, and there's a great body of work regarding the concept of organizational legitimacy. They want to be establish congruence with social values associated or applies with the activities of the norms of acceptable behavior in the largest social system of which they are a part. Basically, what this is all saying is that the need for social legitimacy is universal, and so everyone would be expected to keep pace with broad-based changes in public policies, attitudes, and social norms, because they're all under basically the same institutional pressures from Wall Street. So this basically goes against my hunches that there was some sort of structural systemic effect. Now, institutional theory doesn't say that everyone is exactly the same, though, and there's a great body of work regarding the different sources to explain variations in corporate values and organizational practices. There are industry factors that influence the way organizations behave, and there are industry-specific conventions or traditions. There are the personalities of the senior management team, and their corporate politics. As all of us know, every office is a little different, and there's different people who like certain other people, but they don't like other people, and that's just the lay of the land. There's also a great deal of work in the area of automation, but it has nothing to do with values. It just has to do with organizational structure, meaning basically automation changes the way a business or a corporation is organized, its hierarchies, and there are certain process technology archetypes that differentiate the way the organization is structured based on the production process. So basically, in summary, yes, automation influences structure, but how it affects the adaptation or keeping up with social values is just not well known. And that variations in organizational values are essentially idiosyncratic, meaning it's not systemic. So it's just unique to that particular type of business, or the people who work there, or the backgrounds of the senior executives, or just the politics of that particular firm. So there again, it runs counter to what I was trying to look at, which you would not expect industry automation to be as a systemic influence. Okay, so strike two. So let's look at, well, what about organizational adaptation to new or emerging social values? Well, there's a ton of research in that, but it's not, again, it has nothing to do with automation, and there's nothing to do with any systemic factor. But there was a number of studies that caught my eye that had to do with the adaptation and diffusion of LGBT-friendly HR policies and employee benefits. And you see these three studies, and they're very typical of the types of studies, and then you can see the common theme. And while the effect of automation on organizational values is not known, these two factors, institutional pressure and location effects, clearly influence organizational adaptation to changes in social values. Okay, so we're done with the literature review. Not terribly useful, but it sort of inspired me to look at some other things, which are, are interpersonal skills, teamwork, social intelligence of employee base less important in highly automated work environments? As automation, assumes increasingly sophisticated tasks, human intervention is minimized. It's basically left to exception handling. Given the lower importance of social interaction, do these organizations face less competitive need or lower institutional pressures to keep pace with these changing values? And does the pervasive use of and reliance upon non-human forms of capital by senior management desensitize their perceived need for keeping up? And my working theory was that perhaps employers' relative reliance on human versus non-human forms of capital influences their relative concern about keeping up. So basically what I came after doing the lit review was that I sort of concluded that while corporate mission statements often include trite mottos as, employees are our most important assets, you've heard that a million times, employers who operate in a more automated industry may not need to care as much about keeping up their organizational practices regarding what is considered fair, equitable, and right, given changes in social values. And so I came up with a new theory, and the theory says this: senior management teams and organizations that operate primarily in more human capital-intensive industries are faster at updating their internal corporate policies and organizational practices to align with environmental changes in social attitudes, values, and expectations. Conversely, it's the other way around for those that rely more on non-human forms, and that it could serve as a universal and continuous predictor of organizational adaptation to emerging social values. So universal meaning, doesn't matter whether it's a B2C, B2B, across all types of large employers, irrespective of any other systemic factor. So that's a pretty bold claim. Now, how in God's name do you find empirical evidence to support that theory? And there becomes the tricky part, and this is the focus of the talk. Well, how do you measure organizational adaptation to emerging social values? Well, I mentioned when I did the lit review, one of those studies that looked at LGBT friendly practices used this thing called the Corporate Equality Index by the Human Rights Council. And basically, what I liked about it is that it really uses a broad range of criteria, not simply, same-sex benefit, partner benefits for employees, but just a very broad and very intense metric measurement of their transgendered inclusive health insurance, public commitment, and responsible citizenship. And so I used that, actually the individual scores from all 486. They didn't have all of the Fortune 500 companies, but they had clearly the majority of the Fortune 500 companies surveyed in this index report from 2013. Okay, so that's interesting. So now we have a measure of that. How do we measure automation or human capital intensity of industry? Well, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they track the value of production, hours, and employment, and labor compensation through all these different industries using this taxonomy of 5 different levels called the North American Industry Classification System. So from that data, which again is publicly available, I created 2 ratios. I divided the total labor cost by total production output value as an indicator of the relative amount of money spent on labor relative to output, meaning how much value is produced by human capital by industry. And I also created a degree of automation of industry ratio. Then we simply divided the labor cost by the number employed to reflect the fact that there are generally more workers per payroll in people-intensive industries than in automated industries. Okay, so how do I capture other known factors? So it's one thing to look at the internal validity of these variables, but what about the external validity? We have to pull in known factors in order to compensate or absorb those known effects in order to really more accurately measure the automation factor. So I created these 2 things to reflect those known factors. One, institutional peer pressure. I just used their Fortune 500 ranking. So if you were number 1 and number 2, you were a much bigger company, you would face more public scrutiny, public profile, such institutional pressures than you were a much smaller company in the Fortune 500. And in order to reflect the known location effects, I used the state-based location based on the corporate headquarters where same-sex marriages was legal or not. Again, this was in 2013 before the Supreme Court ruling, and there you see a map of kind of where they stood. It definitely, for those of you in the political realm, you can see that there's clearly sort of red state, blue state kind of factors going on there, but that was a known factor, so I wanted these to control for those known factors. So to recap very quickly, so we got organizational institutional adaptation, institutional peer pressures, state-based location effects, and then these 2 calculations of trying to measure either the human capital or inversely the degree of automation of the industries. So here are my hypotheses. The more employer relies on human capital to create value, the faster its organizational adaptation to emerging social values, expressed, operationalized in those metrics that are on the slide. The greater the labor efficiency, or the more reliance on automation, the slower its organizational adaptation to changes in social values. And then the whole complete model was organizational adaptation to social environmental changes as a function of known influences, public profile, state-based effect, as well as relative reliance on people. And so I ran a correlation matrix, and I looked at the linear strength of those individual scores for all 486 Fortune 500 companies, and then correlated that with their respective values for the two control variables, along with measures of degree of automation for the most appropriate available industry or sub-industry category. And so no surprise for the first two values. So the control values were shown to be statistically significant, and that supports the body of research that says these institutional and location effects do influence adaptation to changes in social values. The interesting thing was the bottom of the slide. So those human capital measurement of a degree of automation by industry were also found to be statistically significant. The higher ratio of total labor cost of the self-disclosed primary industry category, the higher the CEI or Corporate Equality Index score, and the higher the payroll, the lower the score. So basically showing the positive relationship and the negative relationship. So that was, you know, very surprising and very encouraging for me that they actually showed a definite relationship. It doesn't show the causal relationship, but it says basically at the 0.01 level, basically saying that there's a 99% chance that something is influencing. It doesn't say what it is, but that there's a 99% chance that it's not due to some sort of random effect. So here was the real sort of game changer. So I did a hierarchical multiple regression model, and I looked at the predictive strength of these scores relative to those regressed across those two, both the control variables and the variables measuring automation or reliance on human capital. And there you see in hierarchical, you sort of add variables to show the relationship that each variable explains on the coefficient of determination, or the R-squared value. And so I go from almost 17%, and then it moves up to 24.7%, and then finally gets to 28%, which for a sort of macroeconomic study like this is actually considered very, very good. Anything kind of over 20 and under 40, let's say, would seem pretty a strong indicator of the predictive strength. And these are the parameter estimates, or the coefficients, meaning that if, as this model holds, as this linear model holds, any sort of ordinal increase in a Fortune 500 company would be associated with a decrease. I mean, the smaller you are, the less profile of pressure you have, it would be associated with a decrease of 0.105. And then you see the location effect parameters, the human capital intensity parameters, and the degree of automation. So pretty interesting association with this, and I don't know, very surprising. So what does this mean? So basically what this study did was it uncovered empirical evidence of a new determinant of systemic differences in the inclusiveness of employee rights and benefits among large U.S. employers. Again, this operates as a continuous variable across all types of large employers, irrespective of other key factors. There are many, many limitations to this study. I just listed some of the bigger ones. One of the key limitations is it doesn't look for a duration effect. I mean, how long does this difference last? As per institutional theory, you'd expect the gap between inclusive and social tolerant policies versus other ones would disappear over time. And there's, the assignment of labor cost. Many of these large Fortune 500 companies are very diversified, so that causes that confounding fact. And of course, the general assumptions of homogeneity and conditional independence of values is also a concern. But interesting. So here comes the sort of fun part for you people. So this is, I think, is a pretty cool thing, but that's just, it was just the first study of this phenomenon. There's a lot more to be done, and if this is something that you're interested in, I strongly encourage you to pursue it, because it is, what would be really cool is to figure out, okay, so I showed a relationship in this study, but it doesn't show why that is. So you could study, what makes automation an inhibitor or human capital intensity an accelerator of organizational adaptation to social environmental change. What are the other influences that automation has on organizational values and practices? Does automation have any effect on the organization's policies towards sustainability, gender pay gap, work-family life balance, income inequality? Does it impact levels of corporate philanthropy or charitable giving or sponsorship or community outreach and employee health and welfare? I mean, this could be an interesting study of job satisfaction or turnover. I mean, do employees working in more mechanistic environments experience high levels of depression, divorce, alcoholism, or any form of sort of social alienation? It would also be interesting to look at organizational values. Are there other systemic factors that influence senior management teams' decisions on what is right, fair, and equitable in terms of practices? And then, of course, there's the macroeconomic effects of industry automation. There's been this continuing rise, and suddenly in 2005, just a flattening out of productivity growth. No one really knows why. There's, obviously impacts on labor market dislocations, segmentation, and then also there's, there may be some very strong relationship between automation and increased automation and globalization with labor participation rates. There you see the chart on the right, the decrease in men in the workforce from after World War II to now. And clearly something is happening. There's lots of different theories on why that is. There are lots of different confounding variables involved, but it would certainly makes for an interesting area to look into. So where do you begin? Well, if there's one message you get out of this whole webinar is that there's so much data out there now to play around with, and so many free tools out there to play around them with, that if you're interested in things like this and interested in topics like this, you really deserve to start exploring. Obviously, everyone talks about data.gov. Yes, there's a lot of great data, but there's also so many other meta sites where you can have all kinds of data sets regarding there's the Consortium for Political and Social Research. There's the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. There's, of course, the Census Bureau. There's the General Social Survey. You can track the opinions of Americans over the past 4 decades and sort of try to correlate that, try to regress that against other macroeconomic factors. And this list is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things that are out there that you can start your study with. Oh, and now a word from our sponsor. Just to give you a little update or overview of CUNY, City University of New York School of Professional Studies. We're rated one of the top undergraduate online schools, ranked #1 in New York State, ranked 11th in the nation, and our Masters of Data Science and Masters of Science and Data Analytics program is ranked #15 and ranked #27 worldwide. Why students say they choose CUNY SPS? It's 100% online. It helps working adults balance their career and their personal life and study time. We have very reasonable requirements for acceptance at the graduate level. You don't have to take a GRE. We look for a GPA of 3.0 or better. And in our undergraduate program, you don't have to take a SAT or ACT, and we look for a GPA of about 2.5. Very reasonable tuition costs, a fraction is what you'd pay at a private school, and the result, we think we represent one of the best investments you can make in yourself and in your career. And there's the information about the presentation. If you have any questions about the content, you can certainly email me or call me. And then there's Rakshan Ali, who handles the admissions process for the Masters in Science and Data Analytics degree. And that's it. So with that in mind, I tried to do, I made the half-hour mark, and I wanted to leave it open for some questions, which I'd be happy to answer. So Darren, we see can you send me a recorded session? So are we going to do that?
Yeah, we do.
We do. Oh, okay. So we're going to do that. So that is, where and how will AI and machine learning influence your theory hypotheses? That's a really interesting question. The short answer is I don't know, but you know, I would theorize that a lot of that drop-off in the male participation rate probably has something to do with the automation of what I call sort of the first generation of automation of robots in, you know, manufacturing, heavy industry, you know, occupations that are, you know, have tended to be more male-dominated and more what used to be called blue-collar work. Now automation is taking over, you know, legal discovery, some of the accounting tasks, more the white-collar work. So it should be interesting on how this affects, you know, increasingly sophisticated and increasingly professional organizations, and it certainly would make for an interesting research study. With data sets so large, how do you prevent sampling bias? That's actually, this was not a we're only talking about a few thousand data elements here in this study. So by, you know, big data standards, this was a, you know, a tiny data set. I just took, you know, the 486 members of the Fortune 500 company as, you know, the most complete data set I had. I figured that large employers would be the ideal choice, but I didn't try to adjust for any sampling bias of that. I just figured I'd use everything I've got and see how it laid out. How do we compile data set point tool? I just used Excel. I used a few pivot tables to compile the data. I think I used SPSS to do the linear models, but I could have used R. I just sort of hadn't discovered R yet at the time. But, you know, all of this, these are, you know, pretty simple, basic, you know, Pearson product correlation matrix and multiple linear regression are two models that have been around for, you know, eons, and so there's nothing fancy about what I did in terms of the modeling. It's really, it's the sort of interesting combination of a survey of, you know, HR policies and using industry productivity data and all these other very different data sets putting together, which is kind of what I'm trying to show. There's lots of interesting things out there and lots of different creative ways you can pull together different types of data sets to examine you know, different types of phenomenon. The curve showing a decrease in male labor participation. Is there a curve showing an increase in female labor? Yes, there is. Yes, Sam Wong makes a very good point. It does, female labor participation rate, if I remember, increases not quite at the same rate, though. There has been a fall off in the overall labor participation rate, and that is, you know, I should caveat, there's lots of different factors going on, the aging of the population, you know, the different, basically the lowering of discrimination barriers against women in certain professions. So there's lots of stuff going on there. So, but I just thought it was sort of a cool chart to show. Love this presentation, interesting research. How about making it concentration results from other advanced, more like European countries. That's a good point. I focused on U.S., but it would be interesting to explore it. European countries. Europeans are facing similar but not as severe factors in terms of labor participation as well as income inequality. Obviously, on the social, adaptation to social changes, there tend to be, certainly the Western European countries seem to be more advanced than the U.S. is, but it would be good to sort of compare and contrast the two. Where would you go about looking for this data? That's a good question. I don't know whether there's an equivalent Bureau of Labor Statistics. I imagine there probably is. I just don't know that much about European research, but I'm sure if you did a good web search, you probably could find some new sources. In CUNY school, which is the experience? I'm sorry. In CUNY school, which is the experience in clustering methods? I didn't use a cluster analysis in this study. I could have. I'm not sure I understand the question, but you could use a cluster analysis to see what types of behaviors are endemic or shared among different types of industry sectors. I was looking for a systemic factor across all industries, irrespective of maturity or high tech or low tech, or whether they're regulated or very highly regulated or not. But one could do that, and one could use those. Certainly, K-means would be a good tool to use. Is there industry-specific data on workforce makeup, sex education? Yes, there is. Go to U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have demographic breakouts by that and also by industry sector. So I remember looking at that and sort of being amazed at the fact that there are gender factors. It's still in this day and age, there are just amazing gender factors in different industries. I think in the construction industry, I think it's still over 80% male, and in, I think, education, it's still, overwhelmingly high 70s female. It's funny how certain traditions, as institutional theory says, industry-specific traditions tend to last a lot longer than they need to be. Could you give some examples in applying your research results in real life? Well, this is an empirical study. Those things do come from real life. I'm not sure. Perhaps you mean in more of a case study perspective. That certainly would be interesting to see, to do a 1 or 2 or 3 in-depth case study of a particular organization and try to apply these theories on, the adaptation of how people act or how people dress or how people treat each other, or what HR policies seem more updated than not, and try to correlate that with different aspects of the industry of how, whether they rely on human capital or not. Certainly would make for, again, there's lots of different studies you could kick off based on this theory and build upon it, which is kind of why I'm giving this presentation and hoping to inspire you to do that. Sometimes we have a higher value beta coefficient, but R squared is low. Can you explain how we interpret that situation? Yeah, that's a common thing that sort of bothers a lot of us statisticians. They measure 2 different things, but the R square value is about the total explanatory strength of the entire model, where the coefficients are just that factor holding everything the same. So both have limitations, and you can have very strong coefficients and yet a very low coefficient of determination of R squared. But essentially, they do sort of measure two different things. Speaking of the reasons or cofactors, would you consider the prevailing professional background of the personnel, such as humanity, arts, and natural science? You certainly could. That would be consistent with upper echelon theory, which basically says that the professional backgrounds or the types of backgrounds of the senior management team influence the culture of the organization. That tends to be more of an idiosyncratic or case study kind of study rather than a systemic exploration. But you certainly would be interesting to see how you would apply that in particularly, you could look at a certain industries or industry subsector and then compare and contrast those factors as they relate to organizational practices or behaviors. It seems like we've become a service-based economy than a manufacturing-based economy. How data science will help in both? Sam Shahid, that's an excellent question. I would be willing to bet that a lot of that decline in male participation in the labor market would be relevant to that study. Again, you'd have a lot of confounding variables to work with, but if you I encourage you to start exploring some of those data sets, and you never know when you're going to find a relationship between different data sets. The trick is finding out what seems to be a real factor supported by good theory versus what is just random or by chance relationships. And last question, were ratios selected or chosen for your study predefined in general statistics? Do you look at raw data only? Well, I had to sort of create my own ratios because they just didn't exist, or they don't exist as far as I was able to figure out by looking at the what was already published or out there. So do you recommend look for raw data only? Jorge, I do. I know that in research people often rely on surveys and questionnaires, and they typically pick on students to do that. I just I have a personal bias against that type of research. I know there's I'd rather have empirical evidence rather than asking someone who has absolutely no knowledge or any skin in the game to rely on their responses on something. Yeah, I prefer empirical data, raw data, which is why I put that slide in the deck, which I hope you build upon and examine, just to explore, look around and see kind of what data sets are out there, and more importantly, try to creatively think about what sort of relationships can you explore given all those data sets, or what are those data sets, what do you think they're indicative of, meaning what are their internal validity in terms of examining different phenomena. So we're at 12:45. If there are no other questions, I want to thank you for dialing in. I greatly appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this deck, and again, you have my contact information, and if you are interested in the Masters of Science in Data Analytics, we'd love to have you enroll. The deadline for applications for our spring semester is December 1st, so I wouldn't wait much longer if you are in fact interested. And that semester starts at the end of January, so January 2017. So once again, welcome, thank you, and greatly appreciate it, and be in touch.